Greetings, everyone. My name is Wayne Honeycutt, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president and CEO for the Soil Health Institute. I want to welcome you to day 2 of the Soil Health Institute's 6th annual meeting, Enriching Soil, Enhancing Life. We spoke a bit yesterday of all those interconnections of how when you enrich soils, you enhance life. We've got a really great day, I think, planned for you today. This morning, we're going to hear from several experts who are really leading a lot of the way, a lot of their efforts to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation through soil health. And then after a short break, we'll reconvene to hear how we at the Institute and others also are working to establish soil health interpretations that are useful to farmers, conservation planners, and other field practitioners. But first, to get things rolling, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Morgan, the Chief Scientific Officer for the Institute. Christine will be leading the entire session today and program today. In that role at the Institute, she leads our scientific direction, the strategy, the implementation for all of our programs in soil health. Prior to joining the Institute, Christine was a tenured full professor at soil science at Texas A&M University. And when she was there, I know she was highly recognized for not only being an outstanding collaborator, but also an outstanding teacher, researcher, and mentor to students and other fellow faculty members. She's now a fellow of the Soil Science Society of America, having just received that honor just last year. And she's also served on the board of the Soil Science Society of America. She's editor-in-chief at the Global Soil Science Journal, Geoderma, and she's a founding editor-in-chief of the journal Soil Security. And I want to tell you that while those of us at the Institute are continually amazed at her scientific knowledge and her creativity, she's really equally passionate about applying that knowledge to solve real-world problems that are experienced by farmers and ranchers, and that will simultaneously improve our environment. So it's a real pleasure to have her on staff, and I'll turn it over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you for that nice introduction. Welcome, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon. It's great to have you with us this morning. We have a lot to talk about today when it comes to carbon and how to measure and think about and assess soil health. Our first session this morning will be 2 hours, where we are going to be talking about climate change mitigation and adaptation through soil health. Then there will be a 1-hour break, and in the afternoon, we are going to talk about assessing soil health at scale. During the noon for Eastern time, lunch break, there will be a QR code available for those of you that are wanting continuing education credits, and you can scan that code at noon. And first of all, before I forget, I just want to welcome everyone that has logged on to view these talks today and our conversation and our questions and answers and discussion. I want to thank our panelists for logging on and preparing. I know it's going to be some great information, just kind of give us a view of what's going on in the world when it comes to soil health and soil carbon and policy, especially. It has been a year on top of everything that we're going through with this pandemic. As a soil scientist, I always say it's never a more exciting time to be a soil scientist, but I have to say that this year has been both exciting and humbling when it comes to carbon, and soil. There's been so much activity by fellow soil scientists, by policy makers, by private industry, by farmers, and everybody just doing the best they can and scrambling and trying to figure out how we're going to deal with carbon and soil health and our choices in managing. It's just been, if you keep up with what's pops up on the internet every now and then or daily, you see that there's a lot of information on verification protocols. There's evaluation of the verification protocols. There's constant announcements of investment and interest by companies, and farmers are asking a lot of questions about management and engaging in carbon markets. And I've just been impressed by the incredible public and private investment in soil. and in soil science and soil carbon. So it's really an exciting time and a humbling time, because while there's a lot that we know about soil carbon and carbon cycling and the co-benefits associated with soil carbon and improving our soil health, there's also a lot that we don't know. And it's been very interesting to me as soil scientists. I think a lot of times we take for granted what we don't know. Like, it's just kind of when we talk to each other, we know what we don't know. But it's really interesting to hear that conversation in the public space about what we know and what we don't know. And it's refreshing and a reminder of the importance of science and the importance of what we're doing as soil scientists and agronomists and those involved in policy. And wow, have we learned a lot this year. I'm sure everybody has expanded their vocabulary tremendously to words like permanence. You know, how long can carbon that's added to the soil stay in the soil? Additionality, what is that? I think that I could give you a lot of definitions of additionality, and we could spend the next 2 hours arguing over them. Leakage, you know, this concept of soil carbon being added in some places and maybe subtracted to the detriment of other places. MRV, that's the new acronym of the season, which is measurement, reporting, and verification. And it's just really thinking about, if we're going to have carbon markets, we need platforms that enable measurement, reporting, and verification. And as a soil scientist, I always thought you change your management, you get the carbon in the soil, you're good to go. Maybe you need to measure it and report it and verify it. But then now, how is it accounted for? You know, this concept of insets versus offsets. And then last but not least, discounts for uncertainty. That's a lot. And that's just focusing on carbon markets. That's not really thinking about the co-benefits associated with soil carbon and improved soil health. At the Soil Health Institute, our role is in helping drive adoption of soil health management practices. So not only do we improve our soil health, but we also increase the amount of carbon in our soils. So we think about ourselves as enabling supply, but we also are enabling research and development to reduce the cost of certainty, or the cost of being able to measure carbon and know how good our measurements are. So we do R&D with a strong tech to market focus, because as Wayne said, it's really important to me and it's really important to the Soil Health Institute that we get our information out there and our developments in technology out, ready to use, off the shelf as soon as possible. Our R&D focuses are in sampling design and sampling technology. And in a lot of that R&D, as you can imagine, we have many partners. And I am very lucky to work with some of the best in the world in their respective disciplines and capabilities, both in research and in business. But last but not least, and what we're going to talk about today, as well as getting carbon into the soil and improving soil health, understanding those co-benefits, right? As we increase carbon in our soil, it not only can help with mitigation, but it helps with adaptation. And there's so many co-benefits: erosion risk, drought resilience, flood mitigation, water quality. And then on top of these biophysical aspects, there's the social and economic value. Soil Health Institute has posted a lot of economic assessments on farm profitability. If you're curious about that component, please see our website, click on economics, and you will get more than you want. And then also the social value. We've done over 125, we have conducted over 125 interviews of farmers that have successfully adopted soil health management practices. And the interesting thing that we hear a lot in the interviews is that farmers saying that since they have successfully adopted no-till and cover cropping, they go to more birthday parties, they go to more annual reunions, and have more time to spend time with friends and family, and more time to themselves. So that's something that we're not capturing well, of what that value is to, that co-benefit is to our agricultural society and those socioeconomic benefits. So I have rambled on, and I would really like to get to letting the experts do their speaking. And we have a real wide variety of speakers today, from US policy to those engaged in global policy, global soil science, US soil science, dairy. And as you'll see, we start big and we go down smaller and smaller. And then at the end of this 2-hour session, we're going to end at the field scale. Because that's what we do in soil science, we scale, right? We start with where your feet are and we end up across the globe. Our next speaker is Marc Bernard. He's an agronomist and soil scientist with the Coordinator Network and Global Facilities in the Executive Secretariat of the CAP per Mill Initiative, or 4 per Mill Initiative. And I'm really interested. I've done some Googling on his presentation today about the twin regions concept. So with that, Marc, there we go.
I think
Marc.
it works. Great.
There you are.
Great.
Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for having invited me. I was following yesterday, and now just the speech I heard from Bill. Very interesting. I'm not an American, I'm Dutch. So I spent many years in Africa. So I really see that this crisis is bringing us together. So I'm quite happy with that. Now I'll try to share my screen. Where do I'm a bit confused. Oh, here. Up. 1. Do you see my presentation?
I do. It's not in presentation.
Yeah, it's not in presentation. Now it is.
Now it is. Yes.
Great. So I shortened the title a bit to make it clear. Now this is very different from what Bill was presenting. This is more about an international initiative which has no money, but which is there, which wants to facilitate soil health and carbon sequestration and improve livelihoods and food security. So it is different from the approach. So, and I'm coming in a bit more. I'm always very interested in finding solutions. I'm looking at problems and I think, how can we tackle solutions? Now, this is a big initiative. So some food for thought. I like the title, Enriching Soils, Enhancing Life. I really think it shows the connection, and I think this is about life and ecosystems. And I think it goes very well with the One Health approach. And I even thought maybe you can turn it around, enhancing life, enriching soils. In an ecosystem, everything is related to everything, so you might turn it around as well. And it might be an interesting discussion to see, is that true or not? What I want to do with the twin regions and with CAP per Mill, we have the One Health approach, which is now adopted by FAO and the UN, the World Health Organizations. And I think we could also go for something like a One Happiness approach, that to see that we are one world. So this is just for thought, and I start my presentation with giving some instruction. What is CAP per Mill initiative for food security and climate? Now, it is a platform. It's a global multi-stakeholder platform. We have all types. I have to push my bar away from Zoom. So international organizations, governments, international organizations, research and education, producer organizations, NGOs, and companies. So basically all stakeholders in the agroforestry sector. Now, it was founded by France at the occasion of the Paris COP21 in 2015, and is supported since then by Germany and Paris, France and Spain directly. But of course, we have 646 member organizations, including 39 governments from 39 countries. So that's quite nice. So there's a big interest in it. It all combines about 1,900 professionals. It's a big pool of different skills, competences, and backgrounds. And our vision there really is, we worked out a strategy last year and we said, listen, worldwide healthy and carbon-rich soils to combat climate change and hunger. Our mission is really facilitate transformative action. That's our mission. And then approach very decentralized. And I think that went through yesterday and today, even in the 2 previous speeches, that decentralization is important and local empowerment is important. networking. I think dare and learn. I think we will not have many questions before we start. And that was yesterday also. Everybody said, start small, try and see and scale. And I think this will very much stay with us. And with stakeholders on the ground, I think this is important. And now our primary beneficiaries are producers, of course, and the enablers, the people from the private sector who are in touch with farmers, with NGOs, in touch with farmers, with producer organizations, extension services. So really the people that visit farms in low and rural communities, these are the enablers. So an enabler, for example, is Ashan, a veterinarian in Pakistan. He is very much engaged in community development, improved pasture management. So another one is a vanilla agroforestry experts NGO with this toolbar of this Zoom bar always gets in the way. Now, yeah, they're in the Sava region in Madagascar. So Joseph, Christine, and Christian are doing a great job there. And another upla now, Zoom again. Another one is Khadija. She's a young student and agronomist in Niger, Niamey, and she's now helping her back home women and community development in the Kitach region of Niger. Difficult conditions with insurgents and everything. Anyway, so how are we organized? We have our main beneficiaries, I just explained, our enablers and producers, but of course, citizens and regions, we try to assist them as well. We're doing one thing, we're providing core facilities to help them to get organized, to advocate for soil health and climate, and to mobilize support for transformative action projects and twin regions. So you see a bit what it is. And then on the other side, there is an enabling environment, global facilities. And I think Bill just explained how important these tools are that enablers and producers can use actually to, if it is technologies or measurement or reporting, what tools are available, how can we improve the enabling environment, funding issues, incentive schemes, and other things. So really the enabling environment. Now, CAPREMIL has a form of partners, I explained that, and an executive secretariat. And the executive secretariat is using its core funds for the provision of core facilities. So I don't want to run through them, it's too much detail, but this is more kind of everything related to advocacy, organization, promotion that's in there. And so we're having a few like GIZ, the German US aid, let's say, counterpart, strategic partners that help us, that provide funds and provide assistance to improve our core facilities, for example, to accompany countries in the development of their NDGs. And on the other side, we have our partners that form transformative alliances. Let's say experts in remote sensing coming together and see what can we do in terms of monitoring biomass in the field, form a group and provide tools and solutions for our beneficiaries. So they can monitor soil monitoring, all these tools. So this is they come together. So it's building on existing expertise that we're trying to organize transformative alliances. Now we have a consortium of members and a scientific committee and a bureau that take care of governance of the initiative. Now I come to the twin regions, which is the more things. So I think twin regions movement is one health and one happiness. So I think it brings the two together. The goal is really, the overall goal is global regeneration through optimized resource management. If I talk about regeneration, I'm not just talking about ecology, but also social and cultural. Objective of the initiative is to initiate a worldwide citizens movement to overcome the climate crisis and create a system of stewards of Mother Earth. The approach, leverage the complementarity of world regions. I'll explain that later. And assure equal opportunity for all humans. Now, I think the basic idea came to my mind when I was in Madrid with the first time with CAPREMIL. I didn't understand a thing what they're doing. And I looked at the graph that you see to the right, which shows us the per capita consumption and the heights of the bars, and the width of the bar shows the number of people. So the area of each bar indicates our carbon footprint or the carbon emissions. Now you see that Africa, the whole of Africa, has about as much as Germany, which you see somewhere here. So I said, why not marry the two? And so at that time, I was looking at ways of increasing carbon sequestration in sub-Saharan Africa by reducing nutrient deficiencies, especially phosphate deficiencies. But I always wondered how I'm going to fund this. And I'd say, if we can increase drastically biomass production in Africa, we need the money that is in Germany. We cannot do it with the poor people in Africa. They have the area and the potential, ecological potential, but they don't have the means to do it. So I said, why not partner? Now, this is about the whole thing. Investing resources in Germany, in Africa, and vice versa, to make sure that we make optimum use globally of resources available. Now, problem and justification, just a few, I think you all know this graph. We must sequester carbon. It is not enough just to stop emissions. Avoiding emissions is extremely important, but we have to draw down carbon from the atmosphere. We need negative emissions. So since Monday, it is confirmed climate crisis is caused by humans, period. Climate change is therefore is the effect. It is not the cause. It's our system, the way we deal with our planet, that is the cause. This means that we need not just technical innovation, and I think Bill stressed this as well, and system change. This is a challenge for all of us. We have to think of a new way of life. Priorities are emission reduction and carbon sequestration, but I guess we're already well advanced and we should not forget about geoengineering, but as a last resort to balance radiation, we know it is extremely risky. But I think we better do something I don't think it is responsible not to look at it. And we must be damn fast, smart, and effective. Now, sequestration method, it's quite simple. If you look at the Keeling curve, you see that in the winter time, CO2 goes up, summertime, when everything starts growing with the higher temperatures in the northern hemisphere, concentrations come down again. So, and it is true, the World Resource Institute has done a very comprehensive, good study. What are the best options at present? And farming and forestry for now are the only viable option that we master sufficiently to remove large quantity of carbon from the atmosphere. But we must continue to invest into other carbon removal technologies. I think we do not have to forget it. Now, the potential we have, ETH Zurich and CIRAD made a study that went through the international press about a year ago, 2 years ago, and they came up, where can we plant forest where there is not forest yet? Where is an area which is not cropped and which is not already forested? So where can we increase forest? And they said we can do forestry in an additional about 1 billion hectares of additional forest that we could without impinging on agricultural land or urban areas. This could sequester plus minus, I think it's a range of 50% or so. So don't take this series too seriously, but just to give an indication, 205 gigatons of carbon, which would reduce the atmospheric charge of about 100 ppm, bring it down from 400 to 300. But you should not forget that we constantly get, this is the total. So this is what we can achieve over a long period of time. So effectively, it will be less that we can achieve in reduction. So, but if we do it at once, we could reduce it to 300. Now, there's a problem. We have to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more our opportunities dwindle and exponentially increase the cost that we have to take care of the problem and the suffering that comes along with the problem. Now, barriers. I looked a bit at, I played a bit with this graph, and I find it quite interesting. If you see a bit, how much is the difference between removal and carbon emissions and removal? You see, we're not making progress. We're still, more looks to me over the past few years that we're getting more additional carbon in the atmosphere. And if you look at these 2 years, you actually see that Corona had an impact on the emissions, it reduced it, but at the same time, our removal also came down. But this is not scientific assured, I'm just played with this graph and tried to see where it goes, but I still find it worthwhile sharing with you. Now, what are the barriers? Proximity. Most people, and we have denial. Why should I care? But I think this is going away. I think incentives, what do I gain, is very important. Of course, it's an important barrier. Conflict, how can we balance interests? I think this is a very important issue at the political level. And we feel this is why we're making no progress with these global and national. It's too complicated to balance interests. Fairness is a big issue. Why should, who is going to pay for it and who has to suffer for it? And the complexity. Denial, I don't want to talk about it. I think we know what that is. How should we approach it? That is really the key issue. And this is a very important point. We're not talking about pancakes, very simple solutions where we have best practice. We're not talking about a cement factory or an infrastructural plan like you have just passed in your government, where you have good practice, you know what to do, it is plannable. That's complicated, but it's not yet complex. What we're talking about is really complex. And we will not understand, we will understand relationships between cause and effect only in hindsight. And we need to probe and be and dare. And we always have to acknowledge that what we're doing is not the best. We can improve. What we should avoid under all conditions is chaos. That we drift off in chaotic, and this would be catastrophic when become systems collapse, would be chaotic. The only option you have is just to try and get the foot on the ground somehow. This is a system which is very much promoted by people that want to have drastic change in their style. So this is a dangerous area which we should avoid. Now, how do we tackle it? Now, COVID was a big success in terms of development of a vaccine, and it really showed that big government works. If we see what happened around the world, it was fantastic, it was beautiful. Now, that of the other side, there was what we didn't handle as well is now, even here in Germany, you have 55% of the population is vaccinated. It's too little. Many people hesitating. So trust of citizens is important. And again, this is closely related to MRV. The climate crisis, we must acknowledge, is much, much bigger. Yes, so it is really what we're looking at now is a cup of tea, and not an ocean, which is the climate crisis, and much more complex. So we must decentralize, and we need to suit local conditions. Most of all, we need to empower citizens and mobilize their support and creativity. And I think we cannot squeeze out. Like we're paying for garbage and sewage removal, we have to think about polluter pays. We cannot continue to not pay for CO2 emissions. It is just not, it's a turning point, we have to take that. Description of the movement. Now, why do we need it? Now, this is emissions, the carbon depth of Europe since 1960. We have two, as compared to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if you see this 30 gigatons in sub-Saharan Africa, and we, just the European Union, not even the whole of Europe, 200 gigatons of carbon that we have emitted. If you look at the sequestration potential, look at the land area of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So that is rain-fed area. So we have rains. It's not the Sahara Desert, it's sub-Saharan. So really productive area, much bigger. Yes, 20 million, about twice the size of the United States. And the GDP, it's just the other way around. Sub-Saharan Africa, minuscule as compared to Europeans. So the one is rich, but has little ecological options, and the other one is poor and has no economic room for freedom to undertake any extra efforts. So the twin region is a friendship between two distant places on our planet that complement each other in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration potential. Typically places in a poor nation and a place in a rich nation. So what is the purpose? Now, collaboration. Citizens of both places enjoy working, and I stress enjoy, working together to produce emissions and to sequester carbon while enhancing diversity and livelihoods. The goal, they aim at becoming carbon neutral in 2030. If you go into a twin region, for a rich country like mine, you cut your emissions in half, you cut your per capita emissions in half. So we're already a step ahead. And pay off their historic carbon debt from then on. Monitoring, so this MRV, progress is measured by twin regions' combined ecological, social, and cultural development. So we look at both regions simultaneously. Now, what are two complementary places? Now, I give you the example of my place. I live in Ulster in Germany. We are a bit better than the States. We're about at 12.5 tons per capita per year. I think you're about at 18 tons per CO2 per capita a year. We're emitting a total amount of 300,000 tons annually. And our area is very small. We're 3,400 hectares. Now you compare that with Copago in Benin, which is a poor place with 90 to 70,000 inhabitants. They have 0.4 emissions because nobody has a car. They have emissions about even 10% of what we have, although they triple the population. They have a huge area. And they have a low per capita. So they have a GDP, annual GDP of $1,300. We're about at 45,000, so we're rich. But together, so none of the two has a chance to make it without the support of the other. They need our money, and we need their area and culture and other things. So a good example of this is, I think in New Jersey, there's Alan and Nicholas in Ecuador. They're ready. They know each other for 50 years. Actually, Alan was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador 50 years ago. And one day he got a call in 2013 from his friends in Ecuador saying, listen, do you want to engage back in our community to restore our farmland? So they do a farmland regeneration, New Jersey, Ecuador, and I think it's a perfect example. Now, what will they do? The rich, of course, they have to undertake emission reduction and support carbon sequestration and biodiversity in their partner community. The poor, the friendship will enable them to the coordinate transit from exploitative to regenerative land use. Don't forget, in Benin, for example, per hectare, it's 1 kilogram of mineral fertilizer that are applied on average in Benin to agricultural lands, not even the entire area. So you see a bit, they really have problems of making it alive. They're exploiting and mining their soils and people to serve our markets, our world markets, especially cotton, cashew, palm oil. Those are the big crops in Benin. And both, they will start enjoying. So I really see that they look at each other and start, and that's what I see with Al and the two. Now, what are the benefits? Now, for the poor, it's obvious. They get out of the poverty trap.
Mark, we're running past time.
Okay, I'll be finishing 3 slides. Okay,
Sure.
and both have this. So what are the guiding principles? Human rights, one health, one happiness, and accountability. How are organized? Now, twin regions, we have the 2 places have a solidarity pact to assist each other, mutual assistance, share resources, and joint actions. They have a general assembly and coordination unit. They have enablers with services franchising and core facilities that come from Cap Promil that assist them on the other side, global facilities for assistance in MRV, and a transformative fund that provides support to the enablers and the twin regions. Now, I'm not going to show this. This is a payment upon delivery for everyone who wants to follow this. This is how the service system works. I'm not going to explain this now in detail due to time constraints. We tested and developed this in Africa and had great success of having high quality extension at reasonable, locally affordable costs at large scale. So what do we start now from this conference? We will organize enablers abroad in all the countries we're active. We verify feasibility and precision and cost of remote sensing-based biomass monitoring. We will launch a call for expression of interest by poor places in collaboration with enablers. We'll launch a youth contest YouTube video live in 2050. We'll provide a rough estimate of sequestration potential in the communities that express their interest. We will present collective sequestration offer at the COP26, and we'll convince rich citizens in rich places to form a twin region with poor places starting in January 22 and organize the first General Assembly next year around this time. We're looking for sponsors to support, but so this is now happening. We will start building partnerships and transformative alliances starting in 2022 and develop regional roadmaps supporting facilities enablers in twin regions in 2022. Now, if you're interested, you can send me a message, and I please go as well to I have set up on our collaborative platform a small registration form where those who are interested can share it. Maybe we can share this link in the chat. I will do that right afterwards, where you can register and get informed for more information or see how you link up with us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Marc. I'll go on to introduce Jim Wallace. Jim, you could go ahead and pull up your slides while I introduce you. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce Jim. Jim and I've worked together a lot in the last 2 years, and Jim Wallace is the Senior Vice President of Environmental Research at the Dairy Management Incorporated, where he is responsible for leading strategy and oversight of environmental science and research program at DMI. And it's to position U.S. dairy in a global food system. So with that, Jim, glad to have you here today, and I'll go on mute. I see your slides.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Excellent. Good morning, Christine. Great to be here. Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Jim Wallace. I lead the environmental research team at Dairy Management Inc. DMI for short. It's the National Dairy Checkoff Organization. Certainly a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to you, Christine and Wayne and SHI for the opportunity to offer a high-level summary of the dairy industry's net zero initiative and connect it to one of our research programs, as Christine alluded to, that's being conducted in collaboration with SHI. It's focused on feed production in the integration of regenerative ag practices. So at a high level, and I'd like to just offer kind of a high-level summary of the dairy industry's net zero initiative and sort of funnel it down into this feed production research program that we're going to talk about. So background-wise, in April of 2020, so just a little over a year ago, the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy's Board of Directors, and by way of background, the Innovation Center, or IC, it's a pre-competitive organization. It serves to bring together the dairy industry. It includes farmers, processors, others in the dairy value chain. They focus on consumer expectations and social responsibility, including the environment. So the IC represents about 70% of the U.S. milk supply. Their board of directors adopted the following environmental stewardship goals on behalf of the U.S. dairy industry. The goals are collective, and they are from the field to the processor gate. And in general, those goals are to become carbon neutral or better. Carbon neutral in this case referring not just to CO2, of course, but also to methane and to N2O, to optimize water use through recycling, and to improve water quality by more efficient utilization of manure and nutrients. And I want to talk just a little bit about how these goals are going to be advanced. There are two separate initiatives. The box on the right represents the processor side of this. I'm not going to talk about that. The box on the left is the field to farm gate effort, and that's what I am going to focus on, called the Net Zero Initiative. It's led by the dairy industry. It's supported by a collaboration of dairy organizations that include Dairy Management Inc., my employer, the Innovation Center, who I just mentioned, Nutrient, which is a dairy organization owned by 12 dairy co-ops. They focus on environmental issues. National Milk Producers Federation, which is the policy side of the dairy industry, and then U.S. Dairy Export Council and the International Dairy Foods Association, bringing in that export piece. So kind of bottom line, the net zero initiative has sort of two key takeaways. One is to achieve net zero GHG emissions at the dairy level with significant improvements in water quality and quantity by 2050. So largely mirroring those environmental stewardship goals that are highlighted at the top of this graphic. And then number two, seeking to make it economically viable to do so. And certainly that's a heavy lift, and that's where much of our effort is being placed. So ultimately, these two initiatives, the NZI initiative and the processor initiative, will marry up, enabling field to processor gate achievement of the environmental stewardship goals. So one more slide I want to share before I jump over into this is the feed production research piece that I'd like to talk about today. And this is really just a simple schematic to illustrate the connectivity of the four basic environmental prints on a dairy. So those prints are the feed production print, enteric methane, manure, and then the energy to run the dairy. And this slide offers some of the strategies for driving a dairy toward net zero. The feed production piece is the one we're going to talk about today, but I think it's relevant to note that we also have research programs in flight for each of the other three on-farm prints as we seek to support the dairy industry's net zero initiative. So with that, this next slide introduces our feed production program. It's called Dairy Soil and Water Regen. It's a partnership with Foundation for Food and Ag Research, as well as other dairy industry stakeholders. And though feed production is not the most significant GHG contributor to the dairy enterprise, when you look at those four on-farm prints, about 70% of that is comprised of the manure piece and the enteric methane. About 25% is feed production, and then the balance is on-farm energy. So feed production is not the most significant, although it is significant. It does offer perhaps some of the most unique opportunities for a dairy operation relative to soil carbon sequestration potential and water quality, and connection to future revenue opportunities through developing nascent markets. So the program that we're talking about here it's 6 years. It's 5 growing seasons. $10 million is being provided from Foundation for Food and Ag Research, $13.2 million from others in the dairy supply chain. And at a really, really high level, this program seeks to assess the impact of minimal disturbance tillage, cover cropping, in some cases, innovative crop rotations, and new manure-based products on kind of 3 large buckets, if you will. One is soil carbon sequestration. The second is the agronomic and environmental outcomes resulting from where we compare business as usual to advanced soil health management systems and new manure-based products. And the third kind of large bucket is really seeking to enumerate the soil health benefits. And I would readily acknowledge that soil carbon sequestration fits under that broader category of soil health. However, we have opted to treat it separately and think about it maybe even a little bit separately due to the significant opportunity that it has to both impact the farm's GHG footprint and the potential for new market opportunities. So this is our map slide, and I share it because I think it does a nice job of offering sort of the breadth and the scope of the program. What we did was we divided the country into 4 regions: Northeast, Lake States, Mountain, and in California. Those 4 regions, though they're quite large, represent 80% of US milk production. And then within each of those 4 regions, we're partnering with 8 farms, 5 operating dairies, 2 university research dairies, and 1 ARS research farm. And we have 8 key research partners. Our primary partner across all regions is the Soil Health Institute. And then regionally, Cornell University, University of Vermont, UW-Madison, UW-Platteville, Texas A&M, UC Davis, and ARS Kimberly. Within each of the regions, there is a combination of both large plot work and field scale work with water quality and quantity elements, depending on the region. So kind of bringing it all down to, I'll offer kind of 2 key takeaways from this program. And then I'm going to provide a little bit of detail on the various steps of the program. But in terms of two key takeaways, and I hate to take 6 years worth of a project with 5 growing seasons and 8 research partners at $23.2 million and sort of succinctly put it into 2 bullet points. But given the time that we have today, I think that's the best approach. So one key takeaway is ultimately we'll provide scientific veracity to support measurement of dairy's GHG footprint for feed production with consideration for minimal disturbance tillage and cover cropping, in some cases innovative crop rotations and new manure-based products. Secondly, we will set the stage for new market opportunities related to carbon and water quality. And that's hugely important, particularly as we think about how this integrates into farms of all sizes, which is a key element of the Net Zero initiative. And I guess I should also mention that modeling is a key element of this program as well, and I'll touch on that in the final slide. So now I'm going to just talk through the 3 tasks that form this program. The first task is our dairy baseline survey. It's a 1-year program, kind of a snapshot in time. And our goal is to create a database of soil carbon stocks and other soil health metrics to allow for evaluation and assessment of the soil health opportunities across dairy regions. Key soil types are being identified in each region. Within each soil type, we plan to select and sample 4 soil management systems. One will be a management system using a single soil health management practice like cover cropping. The second will be a management system employing 2 soil health management systems. So that certainly could be something like cover cropping and minimal disturbance tillage. The third will be a management system representing business as usual for the area. And then the fourth will be a perennial grass system or something similar to provide something of a point of reference. As a side note, we certainly expect that all dairies are going to have some sort of manure application. And as a part of this program, we are aiming for as much consistency as possible within each of the regions. There's going to be a farmer survey with a 5 to 10 year look back. And then using the insights, we do intend to assess the utility of existing models to simulate soil carbon stocks and emissions. So again, kind of quick summary. The goal is to develop an inventory that relates to soil health status, or that relates soil health status, I should say, to existing practices. And we're seeking to offer insight into the readiness, if you will, of existing models across a host of regions and soil types. The second task, and this task is where the lion's share of the work occurs. This is where we will be looking at 5 years or 5 growing seasons, I should say, over 6 years. And it consists of a combination of large plot work. There's a large plot study in each region and field scale research with 1 to 2 field scale projects per region with water quality or quantity, when this is regionally dependent, overlays of some of the field scale programs. So the large plot work is going to consist of a series of replicated treatments, size of which is going to be dictated by our collaborating farms equipment, looking at differences in tillage, cover cropping, and new manure-based products. In general, we're going to observe 4 years of corn, followed by 1 year of alfalfa. And we think it's critical to observe that 4 years of corn up front. It's the most intensive phase of the rotation to really get a sense for the impact of the management changes that we're making. And this basic format is being followed in each region for consistency, but we are allowing for some regional differences, with the goal being to ultimately connect our research findings and draw reasonable comparisons and contrasts across all regions. Staying with task 2, the second piece of that is our field scale work. And in each of the 4 regions, we will have 1 to 2 field scale studies. These studies will pair advanced soil health management systems with business as usual. So a comparison, half the field will be advanced, half the field will be business as usual. And the basic construct is to provide proof of concept. So these are going to be something of sort of a show and tell for other farmers, but we also will capture real world data over multiple growing seasons, and we will seek to tell the operational the environmental, and the economic story of the adoption. We'll also provide spatial context to the large plot studies, and we will also inform existing modeling. And then finally, related to this large plot piece, in each region, we have either a water quality component or a water quantity component that overlays one of the feed scale programs. And lastly, our task 3, it's all about the education, the outreach, connecting with farmers, connecting with consumers, connecting with NGOs, connecting with others who have a stake and an interest in this work that we're doing as we seek to advance the net zero initiative. So that educational piece is a sort of a central feature of the work that we'll be doing. The one thing I'm going to add in here, and that is we have formed a modeling advisory committee. We're putting that under our task 3. It consists of really key carbon nutrient cycling and water quality models and modelers associated with those specific models. The goal of this committee is to participate in the process really from very beginning. So we've engaged with them at the very, very start of this program. We are continuing to engage with them as we progress forward, and we will through the entirety of the project to ensure that we're capturing data that is most helpful for informing and educating future modeling capabilities. So that concludes my comments on the Dairy Net Zero Initiative overview, as well as a high-level summary of our dairy soil and water regen program. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and I certainly look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Jim. There are a few questions. I think I'll pull out one. The question was around, in this calculating of net zero, how does the off-farm contribution of food stocks, how is that incorporated into the net zero calculation? And, what is the responsibility or the thoughts around the dairy industry as far as pulling in feedstocks, in their soil health and soil carbon?
Yeah. And I think what you're asking is this the on-farm versus off-farm feed production piece.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. The on-farm component of this is very direct. The off-farm piece is a bit more challenging. We have a significant runway. Our goal is 2050 to get to net zero GHG emissions. Exactly how we address that off-farm component is sort of a TBD. And I think it remains to be seen how we connect with our suppliers, our off-farm suppliers of feed production. I suspect over time we will integrate programs to connect. Early on, what we will do and what we are doing as we think about our footprint is we are using basic LCA numbers to reflect the off-farm contribution to our overall footprint. But again, as we progress, I anticipate there will be a great deal of interaction with those suppliers as we seek to better engage in ways to incentivize the adoption of those practices off-farm as well. So I know that's not terribly satisfying. There's a lot more to come in that space, and we have a lot of work to do as we assess how to best integrate that off-farm component.
Okay. And I was said one question, but I see another one that I know a lot of people want to know about. How open will the data flow be in the DMI effort as it's being executed?
So I think nobody is really better situated to answer that question than you, Christine. But our goal is going to be to have this information ultimately available to share broadly. Initially, we will essentially kind of embargo that data within our existing teams as we seek to publish that information, but those data sets will be made available publicly as this program progresses. And I hope, Christine, you might maybe add a little bit of texture to that.
Sure. SHI is kind of the warehouse of the data, the gas, the soil carbon, the gas emissions data. And we certainly need to respect our scientific partners and their need and ability to publish and peer review manuscripts. But we also have a lot of thought about making sure this data is archived and cataloged well so that modelers can start to use it as soon as possible. And then, of course, once the publication component is done, then we can open it up to, third party and more investigations by others. So thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
For your time today. Our next speaker, let's see, find it on the queue. I'm always afraid I'm going to mispronounce people's names, so I want to make sure it's in front of me when I say it. Our next speaker is Dr. Rodrigo Nicoloso. Hello, Rodrigo. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. He is a researcher at Embrapa, which is the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, where his research focuses on soil organic matter dynamics and stabilization in tropical and temperate agroecosystems, greenhouse gas emissions from animal manure treatment, and recycling in agriculture, risk assessment tools to quantify the potential for phosphorus runoff from agricultural fields amended with animal manure, and in the development of decision support software for environmental management of swine and poultry farms. So I think this is a nice segue. I know you're primarily going to talk about no-till today, but I like the connection between going from dairy to more animal systems. So with that, Rodrigo, it's nice to have you. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll let you get started.
Thank you, Christina, for introducing me, and I'd like to say thank you to the Soil Health Institute for inviting me for this talk today. So I'm going to share my screen. Hope
I see it.
Okay,
That's
great. So this is part of the research that I did when I was at a sabbatical at the Kansas State University, working under the supervision of Professor Chuck Rice. So I'd like to say thank you for his collaboration in this research. And as you may know, the Farmer Mill initiative was launched in 2015, promoting soil carbon sequestration as an option for mitigation of atmospheric CO2. And this initiative raised a lot of debate on the potential of no-till soils and conservation agriculture in a broader view to provide soil carbon sequestration. Because some studies published in later years show that if you look deep enough in the soil profile, the carbon accumulation that you often see at the surface of no-till soils is compensated by the accumulation of carbon in deeper soil layers when you have moldboard flow that buries the agricultural, the biomass of the crops deeper in the soil. And if you add up the difference on soil carbon storage in the different soil layers to a deeper soil profile up to 60 centimeters in this study from Luo, or 100 centimeters or 1 meter in this other study from Angers and Paulson, you add up you find out no difference between no-tillage and tilled soils. But most of these studies where these observations came from temperate climate regions. So how about tropical soils? How does no-till work in tropical soils in warmer environments? We have some recent publications that also shows that no-till were able to restore soil organic carbon stocks up to the levels of natural grasslands. So if you see this figure on the left corner of the presentation, most of the studies show that if you convert a native vegetation under intensive tillage system, you end up losing most of the soil organic carbon stocks, up to 30–50%. But when you have no tillage with intensification of the cropping systems, you can restore the carbon stocks up to the level of the original vegetation. And the driving factors for this soil organic carbon accumulation was the duration of no-till. So as the longer you can keep the soil without any disturbance, you allow for the formation of large aggregates and the stabilization of soil organic matter. Another factor is the intensification of these cropping systems, the more crops per year, avoiding fallows, especially in the autumn and the winter. low soybean frequency. Instead of using soybean monocropping, try to rotate with maize or include more maize or cover crops in the rotation. And of course, good soil fertility, especially for tropical soils. Low acidity, because it's a really limitation for crop growth in tropical soils. So in order to address these questions, we run a meta-analysis. We look for publications from no-till experiments compared with tillage soils, assessing soil and organic carbon and total nitrogen storage in both soils. So no tillage was compared with 4 different tillage systems using moldboard plow, disc plow, chisel plow, and other alternative tillage practices that included strip tillage, reduced tillage, shallow disc, and others. We also assessed the effect of crop frequency, either using single or double cropping, and the use of legumes, if the experiments included or not legumes in the crop rotation. We also used a meta regression to test the effects of temperature, precipitation, and duration of no tillage on the difference between tillage and no tillage soils. And we also assessed carbon and nitrogen dynamics in both the no tillage and tillage soils. And this was really important because when you compare the carbon stocks in both soils with their pre-treatment baselines, you have a temporal measurement of the changes of soil carbon stocks in the same plot. So you can distinguish between carbon sequestration in no-till soils or in tillage soils, or if you are only measuring avoided carbon losses by changing the intensive tillage for no tillage. We also include the effects of crop frequency and the use of legume cover crops as well. So we have a very large database for this meta-analysis. We found more than 200 studies published in the later 30 to 40 years. And 116 studies from this database met our selection criteria. That was, they must provide all the information necessary to calculate soil organic carbon stocks in equivalent soil masses. And they must have both no tillage and tillage plots, have the same cropping system, same fertilization, same soil type. So we have a fair comparison between both tillage systems. And you can see here in the white crosses in the graph, in the map, these are the tillage experiments comparing no tillage with moldboard plow. So most of them came from the United States and Canada, some from Europe and Asia. In the yellow dots, you can see the experiments where no till was compared with disc plow. This is very common in Brazil and Argentina because we have a very clay soils here. So the disc plow works better than moldboard plow. In the head squares, most of the studies came from the United States with chisel plow and some from South America as well. And the blue triangles are the studies with alternative tillage practices, most of them from the United States, Canada, and Europe. Okay, so we have the largest database, so up to now with this kind of studies. And these are the results that we found on the comparison of no tillage soils with tillage soils. This is a single point comparison, so we're measuring carbon and nitrogen storage, not sequestration, it's just storage. If no tillage stores more or less carbon than tillage soils. And here in this graph on the left, you can see carbon stocks, and the right side, nitrogen stocks. This comparison is no tillage with moldboard plow, disc plow, chisel plow, and alternative tillage practices. And you can see in the first 5 to 15 centimeters of soil, you find no tillage studies with more carbon than tillage soils. The exception here is the alternative tillage practices that you only see carbon accumulation in the first 5 centimeters. This is because you have lower soil disturbance in the alternative tillage practices, and no difference on the below 5 centimeters. We also find in the black line the same effect that other authors already found for moldboard plow. You have this accumulation of carbon in the 15 to 30 centimeters. This is because of burial of crop biomass. But below that, no difference between none of the tested tillage systems. The same thing we found for nitrogen, accumulation of nitrogen up to 15 centimeters, and a lot of variation below that layer, mostly because you have fewer studies assessing nitrogen stocks. When you add up the different soil layers to a cumulative 100 centimeters of soil, the net effect of no tillage is quite evident. You can see that you have, on average, 6 tons of carbon more in no-till soil than in tilled soils. The same effect was found for nitrogen. When you segregate by tillage systems, no-till store more carbon and nitrogen than other tillage practices, with the exception of alternative tillage that you have lowered soil disturbance. No tillage has more carbon and nitrogen with either single or double cropping systems, without or with the use of legumes, with the exception for nitrogen, that you have no difference between tillage and no-till soils if you don't have legumes in the crop rotation. With legumes, no tillage has is more conservative for nitrogen as well. We also find we test the effects of no tillage duration, the correlation between nitrogen and carbon stocks. That was a strong correlation. So any agricultural practices that favors nitrogen stocks also favor soil and carbon in both no tillage and tilled soils. And we find a significant correlation between temperature and storage of carbon in no-till soils. So what that means? That means if the climate is cold, colder than 8 degrees Celsius on average of the year, the difference between no tillage and tilled soils are negligible. This is because most of the time in this cold weather, spring tillage helps to warm up the soil, have better crop development in this kind of situation. But if the temperatures increases, no tillage works better than tilled soils. They can store more carbon with temperature. This is because resid rotation at the surface of no-till soils helps to decrease soil temperature, increases water holding capacity, and also you have better opportunity in warmer climate to intensification of agricultural systems. These other results that I'm showing here is the comparison of no tillage and tillage soils with their pre-treatment baseline. So now we are actually measuring carbon sequestration or nitrogen losses in the soil based on a temporal assessment. So what you can see here is that no tillage has increased with comparison with the pre-treatment baseline up to 15 centimeters, but tilled soils have this increased as well. So probably you have better cropping systems in tillage soils in comparison with another cropping system with lower biomass production. You can also increase carbon in tilled soil, but not as much as no-till soils. And deeper than 15 centimeters, there is no difference for no-till soils, and below 30 centimeters, most of the tilled soils start to lose some carbon. So this is an important effect here. And for total nitrogen stocks, you can see that no-till soils in black line are accumulating nitrogen at the surface of the soil up to 5 centimeters. There was no difference from 5 to 30 centimeters, and both tillage systems, both no-till and tillage soils, are showing nitrogen losses below 30 centimeters. When you add up the results from the 0 to 60 centimeters, what you can see in the left side of the graph is the soil carbon stocks and nitrogen stocks in the right side. So on the average of tillage soils, there was no difference on soil carbon stocks. So when you have this carbon, even if you have this carbon accumulation at the surface, you are losing carbon deeper on the soil profile. So the net difference is 0. But you have carbon sequestration plus 4 tons of carbon in no-till soils. And both tillage and no-till soils are losing nitrogen when you add up the soil nitrogen stocks to 60 centimeters. And here are the, I think, most interesting results of this research that shows the two factors, tillage and cropping systems intensification regarding carbon sequestration and nitrogen stocks. So you can see that with tillage soils, either with single or double cropping, you don't have differences. If the brackets touch the 0 line, there's no significant difference for soil and carbon. But when you have no tillage, with single crop, you start to accumulate carbon, and with double crop, you increases the potential for soil carbon sequestration. Nitrogen, you don't have any difference for soil nitrogen with single cropping system, either for tillage or no-till soils. But with double cropping systems, both tillage soils and no-till soils are losing nitrogen. This is probably because you have nitrogen mining due to agricultural intensification or removing nitrogen from the soil. And this is what happened when you have tillage with or without the use of legumes. So no tillage soils start to lose carbon without legumes, and no difference you can find with in comparison with the baseline when you have legumes. And when you associate no-till with use of legumes, you have a greater carbon sequestration. Okay, so the conclusions here is that no-till store more carbon than tillage soils with respect to moldboard, disc plow, and chisel plow. And if you have alternative tillage practices with lower soil disturbance, you can conserve more carbon in the soil. Difference between no-tillage and tillage soils are negligible for cold weather, but it's really important for warmer climates when you have a better opportunity for intensification of cropping systems and the use of legume cover crops. Nitrogen is very important, so any practices that favor nitrogen stocks also favors carbon sequestration. And the carbon sequestration in no-till soils depends on the intensification of agricultural systems. If you have 2 or more crops per year, no fallows, this is more, they have more probability to have soil carbon sequestration, especially when you have legumes, cover crops to alleviate nitrogen losses. And some alternatives for temperate agroecosystems are, for example, the use of rye cover crops in the fall between soybeans or barley and vetch cover crops in the autumn and winter as a alternative to fallow in the maize production system. And in subtropical and tropical weather, you have more opportunities for cover crops. So we can start to use, for example, winter vetch in the winter. Radish is a very common cover crop that is growing here, and you have a lot of potential for nutrient cycling and more biomass production, avoiding autumn fallows. And that's it. Thank you for inviting me. And if you want to read more about this research, you can access this research with open access by using this QR code. So thank you.
Rodrigo, thank you so much. That was a really nice, succinct summary of this nice paper. I read it twice already, but it was really nice to hear you go through it and talk about it. I think I got a few more points out of it. I went ahead and let you go use the question time because I thought you were getting into some really nice components. So we'll skip questions for you. But there are a few questions in the Q&A chat box, and you're very welcome to answer those. In fact, encouraged to. There's 3 questions for you in there. Yeah, but thank you so much. And I really enjoyed this last few slides where you give some practical ideas on cropping systems. I think one of the people in our audience will appreciate that. So our next speaker is Dan Liptzin. And Dan, I can pronounce your name without finding the right sheet of paper, but I'm gonna go ahead and look at my script anyway. Dan is a research soil scientist at the Soil Health Institute, where his research interests include exploring human effects on the nitrogen cycle, interactions among elemental cycles, redox-sensitive biogeochemistry, and ecosystem processes in seasonally snow-covered ecosystems. Dan is our lead scientist on our Dairy Net Zero initiative. And I will just say on a personal note, I have learned so much about greenhouse gas cycling from Dan. He's really knows a lot about all the thousands of questions one can ask about methodology and what if this and what if that. So I really appreciate Dan's contribution and knowledge that he gives to the Soil Health Institute. And with that, Dan is going to talk a little bit about our North American project to evaluate soil health measurements, some of the carbon results, and some insights that we've gained on these co-benefits of carbon sequestration. So thank you, Dan. And I'll stay off mute while you get your slides up and let you know that we can see them. So right now we can see them, but it's not in presentation mode. Perfect.
Good. Yeah. Thank you, Christine. So as Christine said, I'm Dan Liptzin. I'm a research soil scientist at SHI, and I'm based in Denver, Colorado. And today I'm going to be using the data from the North American project to evaluate soil health measurements to look at how practices to manage for soil health affect soil organic carbon in ways that may provide adaptation to climate change. So if you look at the published literature on soil health in general, or if you look at what's included in the common soil health indices, there's always some metric of soil carbon included when people want to quantify soil health. But when we talk about soil health, what we're really talking about is making sure that soils are functioning. Functions like nutrient cycling and carbon cycling, functions like erosion resistance and water storage. And while we have ways to measure these functions directly, it is not always easy. But one of the things that might help us is that we often hear that these functions are linked to soil carbon. And in this session today, we've heard several people talk about soil carbon and climate change, both from a mitigation potential, just like Rodrigo was just talking about, so increasing the amount of soil carbon in the soil profile. But when we talk about soil health, usually we're just talking about measurements taken at the surface. And so as Rodrigo nicely showed, we often see differences in the surface and at depth. And so we want to be really careful about using soil health measurements to talk about mitigation. And so today I'm really going to focus on how these measurements might be useful for adaptation to climate change. And we often refer to these as the co-benefits of increasing soil carbon. So that is, by increasing soil carbon, we can improve multiple soil functions that may help land managers adapt to climate change. So just to give you a few examples, we think that carbon is related to field capacity, so the amount of water that the soils can hold against gravity. Again, how it's related to bulk density, to potential carbon and nitrogen mineralization, and aggregate stability. And these indicators are linked to functions like water storage and water movement and carbon and nitrogen cycling and erosion resistance. And changes in these functions could make cropland soils more resistant to drought or changes in precipitation intensity, or to help modulate soil temperature as climate changes. So I'm going to show you data from the North American project to evaluate soil health measurements, or NAPSHM, to look at some of these links between soil carbon and other indicators of soil health, to assess whether adopting soil health practices provides co-benefits and the potential for climate adaptation. And this project could not have been taken place without the support of our funders, General Mills and the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, as well as our partners, Soil Health Partnership and the Nature Conservancy, and dozens of partnering scientists at institutions across North America. And the overall goal of the project was to identify the most effective indicators of soil health by studying the effects of soil health management at long-term ecological research sites. And my goal today is to use this data set to highlight what controls patterns in soil carbon and how increasing soil carbon may provide co-benefits. One of the great values of the NAPSHM data set is it captures variation in climate and soils types across the major agricultural regions of North America. So you can see from the kind of colder and wetter regions here, these black dots represent sites where the experiments are, to these regions with the red colors where it's hotter and drier. We have a really good spectrum of sampled sites. And there were over 2,000 soil samples analyzed from the 688 treatments that were present at the 124 sites that we sampled. And one major benefit of this experimental design is that the soils were collected with identical methods. And just to reinforce just the surface 0 to 15 centimeters for these soil health measurements. So it doesn't make sense to talk about carbon mitigation with this data set. But we're able to compare across sites to determine the effects of soil health measurement treatments. And so the NAPSHM data set is quite rich in terms of the soil health indicators that were measured. Each of the more than 30 chemical, biological, and physical indicators, as well as supporting measurements like texture and pH, were quantified at a single lab with the same analytical method. So the same field methods were used, the same lab methods were used, same depth was used. And this is just a partial list of the methods, and I've colored in red the ones that I'll focus on today. And so in addition to the collection of soils, we also compiled a 5-year management history to capture the cropping system, nutrient management, and soil physical disturbance at these sites. So let's begin our exploration by looking at the entire soil organic carbon data set. So looking at these 2,000 samples. And so we can partition the variance of these 2,000 samples into 3 sources. So how much of the variability is related to differences in the means among sites? How much of the variance is related to differences among the means of treatments within sites? And how much is related to differences among replicates within treatments? And so from this graph, you can clearly see that the site effect dominates. So there's a lot of variability among sites. And this shouldn't be too surprising because we know that soil carbon varies widely across the continent due to factors like climate and texture and topography and mineralogy. When we look at these other 2 factors, ideally we would like this variation due to replicates to be really as small as possible. And in this case, it accounts for about 1/10 of the total variance. And then the variance among treatments represents the effects of management within the sites. And that also accounts for about 1/10 of the variance in the whole data set. And so as I mentioned, there's a large literature exploring what controls soil organic carbon at various spatial scales. And I've just picked a few of the variables that are thought to be important. So this is looking at site means of soil organic carbon versus versus mean annual temperature on the left and clay content on the right, and the R squared of these simple linear regressions. So we can explain about 28% of the variation in carbon with just temperature, or about 5% with just clay. But if we put these together with other important site level variables, so precipitation, including irrigation, sand content, and pH, we can get up to explain about half of the site level variance. And so, this is the variability that's largely out of the control of land managers. So this variability is controlled by the site. So, but what about the role of management? So within our data set, we found paired treatments that varied in only one soil health practice. And so the number of those paired treatments ranged from 21 for cover crops up through 199 for crop count. And I'll explain in a minute exactly what these treatment means, what these practices mean. But one way we could analyze these data is we could take each one of these paired treatments. So for cover crops, we'd have 21 pairs of treatments, and we could look at them individually. But it's really difficult to find significant effects when you just look at the individual sites, because there tend to be only a few replicates. On average, we had 3 replicates for treatment. So it's really hard to find site level effects of individual treatments. And so the power of the NAPSHM data set is that we can use these treatment pairs as our replicates using a technique called meta-analysis, similar to what Rodrigo showed. And so the plot here shows the results of testing each soil health management controlling for site, as we have multiple treatment pairs for each site. And the dots here represent the mean effect of the treatments, so the percentage change from adopting these soil health management practices. And then these bars represent the 95% confidence limit. And so similar to Rodrigo's presentation, if these bars overlap this 0 line, as it does for crop count, we say there's no significant difference. And if they don't, then we say there is a significant difference. And so if we start at the bottom for these practices with tillage, in the NAPSHM data set, we also find an effect of tillage at the surface. So an increase in soil organic carbon of about 10% if we compare at the same time treatments that have some kind of decreased tillage to some treatments that have some higher amount of tillage. And so we limited these treatment pairs that they only differ in this one practice. So everything else about the management is the same except for tillage. Similarly, for cover crops, we see about a 10 or 15% difference in soil carbon, so higher soil carbon when there's cover crops at least one time during the cropping system. If people used organic nutrients in the form of manure, compost, or biosolids added in place of commercial fertilizer to supply either the nitrogen or phosphorus for the crops, even larger effect of that treatment. So residue retention, once again, about 10%, where we're comparing a treatment where residue was retained during the rotation versus residue was removed during the rotation. And then these 2 treatments at the top are both about what was included in the cropping rotation. So looking at 2 different ways of looking at the diversity of cropping rotation, diversity in the crop rotation. So first is just the crop count. So this is comparing a monoculture to a rotation that had more than one species, and really no difference at all in that. The second way we looked at diversity is what I call rotation diversity. And so this is comparing where one treatment was a rotation with only grains in it and no fallow period. And the second was a treatment with the substitution of any other type of crop, usually legumes, but in some cases cotton or safflower or other crops as well. And it tends to be on the negative side, but once again, the bars are not, crossing 0, so we can't say that this is a significant effect. And so now I want to expand beyond looking at just soil organic carbon to these other indicators that we measured linked to soil functions. And so this upper left panel here is the same one that we're just looking at, but now I've added panels for these other 5 indicators. So potential carbon mineralization, potential nitrogen mineralization, aggregate stability, field capacity, and bulk density. And the main thing I want you to notice is that the pattern for all of these indicators is largely the same. So these diversity practices, so whether it's rotation diversity or crop count, with the exception of potential nitrogen mineralization and bulk density, they're largely not that different and never different for crop count. And then these other 4 practices, you largely see an increase in the indicator with the adoption of the soil health practices. The one exception is bulk density, where we actually want a lower bulk density with the soil health practices. So the pattern's largely the same for all of these indicators. But if you look at the x-axis of all of them, you can see the effect size is different. So soil organic carbon, 10 to 20%. Similarly for aggregate stability, around the same range of effect size. The effects are larger for potential carbon mineralization and potential nitrogen mineralization, where we often see a 20 to 50% increase. And in contrast, for field capacity and bulk density, while still significant, the effect size is much smaller. So just a change of just a couple percent. And so I want to explore these patterns in a little more detail and so we see the overall trends are the same, but now we're looking at the correlations among the responses of these indicators. So looking at the correlation between the response, and I focus on tillage here just because we have the most treatment pairs and a significant difference. But we're looking at the correlations between the response to decreased tillage of soil organic carbon and bulk density. So not only is the overall effect similar, but the response of individual sites must be similar because these indicators are correlated with each other. So once again, we expect bulk density to show a negative relationship, and it does. And for field capacity, aggregate stability, potential carbon mineralization, potential nitrogen mineralization, all positive correlations. So we're seeing all of these indicators respond to these soil health practices in the same way. And so another thing we wanted to look at is how universal these responses to tillage were. So now I'm showing you the response to decreased tillage on the y-axis and the precipitation on the x-axis. And you can see that there's really no pattern with precipitation. So in our data set, we didn't really see any response to decreased tillage. We didn't see the response to decreased tillage changing with precipitation or any of these other site factors that we look at. And so we're still learning exactly what these relationships among indicators mean, but I want to finish with an example of how these co-benefits of carbon may provide a mechanism for climate adaptation. So my colleague at SHI, Diana Bagnall, used the NAPSHM data to create a model that predicts available water holding capacity from just clay, sand, and organic carbon content. And so what you notice is that as you increase organic carbon, you change the available water holding capacity tremendously. So these blue lines represent an increase in the amount of water that's available for these crops. And so there's this direct link to increasing soil organic carbon to drought resistance and climate adaptation. So in conclusion, the site factors largely govern the amount of soil organic C, but these soil health management practices can increase soil organic carbon in most soils. There weren't simple relationships between the site factors and the size of the soil organic response to management. And finally, because the soil health indicators respond in a similar way to soil organic carbon, we suggest that adopting these practices that increase carbon in the surface soil should provide these co-benefits and provide mechanisms for climate adaptation. And so with that, I want to thank all of our partnering scientists and our funders one more time.
All right, thanks, Dan. We have time for one quick question. I think it's a great one. It's one that we've discussed. Can you provide an explanation why crop diversity was not contributing to soil carbon increases?
Yes, so that's something, yeah, interesting. So with crop count, we would really see no effect of just increasing the number of species. And with the rotation diversity, we also see a trend to decreasing carbon. And the most common example we have in that is comparing continuous corn to corn soybean. And that's something that's been seen pretty widely in the literature, that having a plant residue like soybean in the mixture that decomposes relatively easy and has a higher carbon to nitrogen content seems to lead to greater mineralization of carbon in the soils.
All right, thank you, Dan. Now we're going to turn to our last speaker, Jason Ackerson. Jason is a research soil scientist at the Soil Health Institute, and he serves as the project scientist for soil carbon measurement and technology discovery projects. Jason recently joined the Soil Health Institute from the University of Purdue, where he was extension faculty, and he comes to us today from Indiana. And Jason is going to talk about some work that he did while at Purdue. So take it away, Jason. I'll stay on until I see your slides up.
Probably unmute myself too, huh?
That'll work. That improves things.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, so we've had a pretty good session this morning, giving some context to the different ways that management can impact soil organic carbon. And I think Dan's talk is a pretty good intro for this discussion. So Dan has showed using NaPeShim how we can understand how various management practices would impact soil organic carbon. And what I'm going to talk about today is some work of taking that same idea and maybe scaling it out a bit. So we know which practices we can adopt to impact soil organic carbon stocks, but we might not know for any particular soil how those stocks might increase. So what's the potential for carbon sequestration for an individual soil? So this work is sort of trying to take one approach to looking at that. See if that works. So, you know, if we think about a landscape that might be managed either at a sort of watershed scale or an individual farm scale, there could be quite a diversity of soils, and each of those soils might have a different carbon sequestration potential. So if we were trying to understand that from a sort of classical experimental approach, what we would do is we would establish sort of a long-term field trial. And it's nice to have some NaPeShim data to sort of tee up this discussion, because all of the data from NaPeShim is really developed using this methodology of long-term agricultural experimental trials, right? So we establish a field trial on one set of soils, and we might have a series of management scenarios. So these might be, like Daniel showed, reductions in tillage or adoption of various cultural practices like cover crops or changes in fertility rates. And we would analyze those soils by imposing a different management regime and then observing those soils over time. So we might take some baseline measurements and run that crop rotation or tillage system for X number of years, and then measure our soil health indicators at the end to see what kind of change we have in those indicators. The challenge with this is we really have a set series of management regimes. We can't change management regimes too easily in the middle of an experiment. It also takes a long time. Some of these indicators might be very rapid. Other ones, carbon comes to mind, can take many years to actually show appreciable changes. And understanding the full magnitude of those changes might take on the order of decades. And the other complication of this, right, is, as I mentioned, not all soils are created equal. So the two soils we're showing here are taken from the same field, just in different landscape positions. So on the right is a poorly drained soil, and on the left is a well-drained soil. And you can see just from the indications of the colors that they have different morphologies and different soil carbon content. So wetter soils tend to hold more carbon, they end up looking darker, and drier soils tend to hold less carbon, they end up looking a little bit lighter. But remember, these are in the same soil, same field, same management scenario, and they have different potentials to store carbon. So if we really wanted to understand how these two soils might differ in their carbon sequestration potential, or really any soil health indicator for that matter, we would need to have a separate field trial for each soil. And I kind of drew this diagram up to sort of explain or illustrate visually how big of a challenge this could be, right? So if we even have a modest number of soils, in this graphic, 8 soils, we're looking at 8 times 3 or maybe 4 management scenarios. That becomes really onerous and really complicated, and not really practical to understand these data at a larger scale, right? So we need some alternative frameworks for understanding or quantifying the potential of soils that don't require extensive field trials, because this gets very onerous. So the goal and objective of the study is to test an alternative approach to field trials for predicting soil carbon sequestration potential. And really here, the goal is we want to develop a methodology that's scalable and flexible so we can apply it to multiple soils and across large geographic extents. And it needs to be a sort of different way of looking at understanding soil. So the approach my colleague at Purdue and I adopted was to try to integrate process-based biogeochemical modeling with digital soil maps to develop maps of carbon sequestration potential. So with a biogeochemical model, we can, instead of observing the soil in the field, we can actually simulate what happens to a soil under a given management scenario on the computer. So we can think about, instead of field trials, these are sort of computer trials. And then we can try to take some data about those soils from our simulation results and implement them into a digital soil map. So our approach for this sort of pilot study was using just a single management scenario. And what we did is we started with simulating soil organic carbon stock evolution for 100 years of that management scenario. So we're already dealing with timescales that we can't really utilize field trials for. And we did all of the simulations in DSAT coupled with a Century subroutine. And from those modeling results, we were able to quantify the stock evolution over time. So we're really looking into what's the final soil organic carbon stock at the end of that 100-year simulation. And from those, we can take that sort of same framework of simulating carbon stocks, and we did that for a series of 120 benchmark soils. And I'll show you the study region on the next slide. And from those, we can try to find linkages between the simulated carbon stocks and quantifiable, what I'm calling static soil properties. So what are the site conditions that lead to a particular combination of soil organic carbon stocks? And then can we take that model that relates the site conditions to the simulated carbon stocks and use that as a sort of transfer function to develop a regional scale carbon sequestration maps? So as Christine mentioned, we started the study when I was at Purdue. So our focus was in the sort of Indiana and Ohio till plain. This is MLRA 111. We combined MLRA 111 with all of its subcategories. So you can see it's a bit broadly like 1 to 2 state large regions. So it's a pretty big geography. And this would make doing field trials for every soil in this geography, impossible. Right, there are over 28,000 soil components, so unique soil map components in this region. So doing a field trial on each one would be very difficult. So for each soil component in the region, we developed this data set of 60 static soil properties. And these are properties that are essentially used to calibrate and constrain our soil carbon model. They're also used for the mapping exercise sort of at the end of this process. So we collected a series of 120 of those soils that represented a diverse suite of soil properties, and we used those for our DSAT calibrations. DSAT modeling. So we've taken a number of soil properties, and then from that picked a very small number of samples to actually do our modeling on. So we're not modeling every soil in the region, just a small subset. So the way the modeling approach works is, like I mentioned, we take a series of soil properties. So these are things like the water holding capacity, the texture, the bulk density, the drainage rates. And we use those to simulate soil organic carbon stock evolution for the 0 to 30 centimeter depth for 100 years of sort of a conventional corn and soybean rotation, right? This is the Midwest. That's the main form of agriculture. We kind of wanted to know what the baseline business as usual stocks would be for all of these soils. And from those model outputs, we get these time series for each of those 120 simulated soils that show how the soil carbon stocks evolve in time. And each of those time series is unique to that individual soil type. So the individual soil properties that define that soil are also constraining the way that soil might look. And from those time series, we can actually estimate the final stock of that soil, indicated here by the dashed line. So we're looking at changes in soil carbon stocks on the y-axis versus time on the x-axis. So in this particular soil, we're seeing a decrease in the soil organic carbon stock, sort of leveling out at what we're calling the sort of final soil organic carbon stock. And that's what we'll do all of our modeling on. So just to reiterate, these curves and final stocks are unique to each of those soils, right? The types of soils are impacting the way the model is predicting that soil carbon would evolve in time. And then we can estimate those soil organic carbon stocks from these graphs. So that gives us a hypothetical soil organic carbon stock after 100 years of the conventional management routine. So the next thing we wanted to do was see if there was a relationship between those hypothetical carbon stocks and the properties of the soils at the sites. So what we did is we took the soil data that was used to constrain the DSAT model. So these are what we're calling static soil properties, like texture, bulk density, water retention, those sorts of things that change very slowly with management. And we built an empirical model that relates those static properties to our simulated soil organic carbon stocks. So the graph you're looking at here are predicted soil organic carbon stocks based just off of those site properties. So instead of using the DSAT model to estimate our predicted soil organic carbon stocks, we can use the properties of the soils themselves. So just like I showed you on our third slide, we know that soils with different drainage rates are going to have different carbon sequestration potentials. What this model lets us do is actually quantify those differences and apply them to any soil. So any soil in the region, if I know its particular combination of textures and drainage classes, we can predict what the soil carbon stock would be after that 100 years of conventional management. And you'll notice that the relationship here is actually pretty good between our simulated data and our modeled data. So the solid line here represents the 1-to-1 line. So ideally, all of those points line up right along the line. We see pretty good correspondence between our modeled data and our simulated data. So eventually what we want to do is we want to take this and build a regional scale map. So we know the soil properties from USDA soil maps for all of the soils in the region. And now we can build a map of carbon sequestration potential for each soil. So the color here represents the final hypothetical or simulated soil organic carbon stock for each soil. So darker colors represent higher carbon concentrations, lighter colors represent lower carbon concentrations. And at a regional scale, this map's maybe a bit hard to understand, but we can see various patterns related to the soils, large soils in the region. So we see some sandy soils in the Northeast that have lower carbon sequestration potentials, and the clayier soils sort of in the Ohio till plain lobe have higher carbon sequestration potentials. But we can also, because this is a map at 30 meters resolution, we can zoom in to particular extents and look at a more granular level what's going on. So this box is going to show you where we're going to zoom in on the next slide. And here we're looking at a much more detailed map of the soil carbon sequestration potential from our simulation exercise. And one of the nice things that this map allows us to do is identify or highlight soils with high or low sequestration potential. So I've denoted some dark colored soils here. So again, darker color means higher potential stocks. These are soils where we would see larger concentrations of carbon than the lighter colored soils that might be low carbon sequestration potentials. So what this map lets us do is really identify particular parts of the landscape that might be better for investment in carbon sequestration. We could target sequestration measures on soils that are going to have really high stocks, or conversely, we could do conservation efforts on those soils. So if we know that soils have high stocks already, we might want to do some more conservation on those rather than putting those soils into production or keeping them in production, as the case may be. So in summary, by coupling these biogeochemical process models, we can generate maps of soil carbon sequestration potential at very large scale. So we have a sort of empirical model that relates soil properties and site conditions to the final carbon sequestration potential. And this is a really useful tool because it might give us leverage in areas where we don't have extensive field trials to understand carbon sequestration. And these data could provide a really useful guidance for management and policymaking. By knowing which soils have high sequestration potential, we can really define or constrain which soils we might want to manage in a particular fashion. So hopefully we have time for questions before lunch.
We do. Two questions that are kind of similar, Jason, so I'll ask them and you can answer both of them at the same time. The first question is from Oren Hoffman. Can you guess how sensitive your model is to climate change? And then I think the same kind of question comes from Marion Friesen.
Yeah.
Could you speak to whether you expect the biogeochemical microbial processes that are operating in the near future will work in the same way, the same parameters in the far future with changes, I think primarily respect to changes in soil carbon?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. And that's definitely one of the sort of weaknesses of this approach is we're not looking at a change in climate. We're really thinking about, so for a bit more detail, the climate data used in the simulation were simulated climate based off of historic weather in the area. So we're assuming that climate change is not impacting these results. So we can really think about this data not necessarily as what the soil might look like 100 years from now, but if we keep everything the same for 100 years, what it would look like. So it really gives us more of a potential or a capability rather than an absolute value. I will say that in a lot of these models, temperature is a factor, or in all of the carbon models that I'm aware of, temperature is a factor in how the model simulates the carbon dynamics. So if we had weather projections, we could implement them into a system like this and get a similar result. I'm assuming that really it's not going to change the spatial pattern of what we see in the final maps, but rather magnitudes. So we might see different carbon stocks based off of those temperature patterns. But really what I think is valuable about this approach is not the absolute value of the stocks, but rather the relative stocks within a landscape or across a region. But being able to identify these soils are going to have lots of carbon, these soils aren't going to have as much carbon, we can maybe target management in a better or more informed way.
And lastly, what was the management practice that was used for the simulation?
Yeah, it was a sort of what we might call business as usual. So a corn and soybean rotation with a conventional tilt. So it was based off of some calibration data we had for that system.
Okay.
But certainly we could do the same exercise for other routines.